Hello everyone, today we talk about Louis VIII of France for our biographical series. We talked about French kings in separate thematic videos. We need to focus more on their individual reign. We started that from quite a while only with the English monarchs, and mostly because we were essentially making the original history series about medieval England. It turned out it was easier to talk about the individual kings, or at least multiple ones in succession as far as their governmental, political, military action was concerned. Now I decided to introduce a bit more of strategy, biographies, general sort of overview of the actual actions of these individuals, as opposed to some more sort of systemic regional observations that we'll keep doing. So here we're just grafting other branches in the tree, the cycle tree, so to say, of Schwerpunkt topics choices, acting, however, a bit also as specials, because at least as far as biographies are concerned, there are so many people to cover in such a random way that it's sort of easy to draw. The objective is naturally covering at least most of the major rulers, commanders, knights. We're talking the Middle Ages, but we can expand this to really many different figures, saints, princesses, other figures like also mercenary captains, you name them. And this video is interesting to the degree that Louis VIII of France is can say overlooked figure, but definitely one that deserves more attention foundationally, as being sort of in between two great generations. He belonged, of course, to his own as well in importance, but he was son of Philip II Augustus and the father of Louis IX, of Charles of Anjou. So we're really looking at a moment of great French expansion and territorial compaction, naturally clashing with the major neighbors. As we will see now, Louis VIII is the attempt at the invasion of England historically. So we will also perhaps make a video about the First Barons' War from probably a military standpoint that can shed more light on this as far as YouTube standards are concerned. Louis VIII of France, known as Louis the Lion, by the way, he was born on September 5th, 1187, quite a year, the one of the Battle of Bouvines, the fall of Jerusalem in the Holy Land. As you know, the French had historically hegemonized the Ottoman states in a broader cultural, social terms, so they basically led the Crusades, and as the most powerful kings of the entire Christendom, debatably also the most Catholic in different ways, but we will in fact also make more specials about the mystique, especially the French monarchy, that, as you know, is effectively imperial, especially starting from this point, if we talk the Capetians, because, as you know, the Franks had always had the tendency for that matter. So that's also why it's important to properly pave the way, sort of stone after stone, with these characters, because you can read in them also what a more modern or secular narration wouldn't provide you. All right. Louis died on November the 8th, 1226, at Montpensier in Auvergne, central France. He reigned as King of France from July the 14th, 1223, until his death, marking his as the 8th king of the direct Capetian dynasty. As a prince, he invaded England, where on May the 21st, 1216, he landed unopposed on the Isle of Thanet in eastern Kent at the head of an army, and was even proclaimed King of England on June the 2nd of the same year by the rebellious barons in London at Old St. Paul's Cathedral. That was a marvel to behold, with great pomp and celebration in the presence of all of London. And if this wasn't, of course, alone just a reason, right, to study this character and how, at this point, his figure transpass the same Frenchness in terms of possible imperial control. Like you can appreciate that he was, at least theoretically, the King of England. He was at least officially crowned by the rebels at the time of John's reign. There is a point, actually, that he was never actually crowned due to the absence of an available archbishop for the anointing. So everything was done, again, we'll see it better also in the video about the First Barons War, a bit hastily. Hence, there is a legitimate historiographical debate on whether he was an actual English king. He can be considered such, or at least as some sort of anti-king in this context, because there wasn't much of that tradition in England for that matter. There were attempts of sort of political sidings, but it's not like in Germany, for example, where that was more habitual, nor in France for that matter, also because England and France shared a big deal of political and institutional development. They were the most feudal monarchies, at the same time also the most national countries out there. And Louis VIII, also for this reason, was excommunicated by a papal legate, the Cardinal Gualabicchieri, on May the 29th of the same year at Winchester, given that, of course, like he's doing what was already paving the way to his proclamation to English kingship. By the way, excommunicated along with his followers and remained under this ban until it was lifted following the Treaty of Lambeth that basically put an end to the First Barons' War, with the French coming home. With his system, and if we can't so say, because of course, the so-called English barons were effectively almost all French. Now, with the assistance of allies in England and Scotland, including homage from King Alexander II of Scotland on behalf of his English possessions and many English nobles, Louis gained control of approximately one-third of the English kingdom during the First Barons' War, part of southern Wales that was yet to be fully conquered, as you know, that would happen down in the later 13th century by Edward I. And also Winchester on June the 14th, from where, as we've seen, he had been excommunicated, the same 1216. Everything happened that year. And soon over half of the realm. You know that this French attempt at the conquest of England, or better, the, let's say, French attempt at having their king recognized as King of England, is contextual to the aftermath of the brutal Anglo-German defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, the Sunday of Bouvines, one of the most, possibly in strictly political terms, the most, at least consequential battle in medieval history as far as the fate of different countries being decided probably on that battlefield. So King John here, the year before, he had been essentially obliged to sign the Magna Carta. In part, as you know, he will actually go on fighting and die undefeated, which is something you want to appreciate about John, that managed actually to keep his kingdom together north of the Channel. And that, in quite concrete terms, had, however, drastically destabilized England to the point that the French thought, well, that they could invade, right? Which was a massive sort of operational, logistical feat to pull off. But obviously, if, let's say, you had enough support in England, for that matter, you could and would be supported, in fact, by these rebellious barons to prove, again, that geopolitics does not exist if there is any sort of political viability. Things are done, right? And so one of the few, but in this sense, clamorous attempts at invasion of Britain historically, failing in this case, Louis was eventually, in fact, defeated by English loyalists and those barons who swapped sides after the death of King John on October the 19th, 1216. Wu's 9-year-old son Henry III, made an entire video about his reign, became the focus of renewed unity among the nobility. Because John had been really tough and harsh, and in this sense actually successful. But obviously, after his death and the minority of his son, there wasn't much that let's say, the royalist party could use to threaten the barons that obviously were not simply happy to have the Capetians now with foothold in Britain. Undeterred initially, Louis besieged and invested the Hertford Castle in December 1216, receiving a truce proposal from Regent William Marshall, the first Earl of Pembroke. I recently made a video about him, lasting from Christmas until January the 13th, 1217, which he accepted, while traveling back to London and threatening to burn St. Alban Abbey for the abbot's refusal to recognize him as King of England. Louis's army was beaten, however, at the Battle of Lincoln on May the 20th, 1217, and his naval forces were particularly defeated, first at the Battle of Dover and then decisively at the Battle of Sandwich on August the 24th, 1217. This basically severed at least in the season, in this campaign, the broader military fort, the French capacity to wage war in England. And in this naval clashes, important reinforcement, the latter, the Battle of Sandwich, witnessed the reinforcement sent by Louis' wife Blanche of Castile being annihilated, forcing him, in fact, at that point to make peace on English terms. The Treaty of Lambeth, signed on September 11th, 1217, included an amnesty for English rebels, a pledge from Louis never to attack England again, and payment to him of 10,000 marks of silver, which was really a big sum at the time, in exchange for renouncing his pretensions to the English throne, showing that still at that point Capetian France had the capacity to politically hegemonize parts of Britain, to destabilize fundamentally the English monarchy. So at this point, not directly waging war in the short term, which could have happened once again, but still, something that could be, in fact, paid off, but against a pretty considerable sum of precious metal. Louis was the first son of King Philip II of France, so he was probably like the ideal sort of successor of his father's accomplishment. You know that Philip Augustus, in this sense, is such 1165-1223, such a traditional monarch in imperial Catholic terms. He officiated the mass at the battle before the Battle of Bouvines on the field. He properly conferred France a very sort of more straightforward national French as opposed to Western Frankish identity. He defeated, in fact, his main rivals, the Angevins, taking over an enormous amount of land belonged to these former rivals that were also his French vassals, but in this sense there was all the connection with his own father's former marriage with Eleanor of Aquitaine, and so the fact that instead he had half sisters from her. But as you know, Eleanor, let's say, coupled quite successfully with Henry II to have a multitude of children, including 4 kings of England that all fought against the French, including John, for that matter. Just citing the last, that here didn't outlive the same Philip Augustus. So it's such a great patriarchal figure, right? And deserving the title of Augustus for that matter. Louis' mother was Isabella of Hainaut. I made a video about medieval Hainaut recently, so you can check that land, very important land, out in the Low Countries. 1170, 1190. She died young, as it was dreadfully frequent for many at the time, especially women in labor. And from her, Louis inherited the county of Artois, that I also made a video on. That is also very important, arguably even more for the French crown, because it was hotly contended between, in fact, the Capetians and their Flemish vassals, or their French vassals as Counts of Flanders. Though Louis was not formally invested in it upon her death in 1190, right? Instead, his father allowed him nominal control over the country to learn about governance first. Naturally, he wasn't king yet, so it wasn't much of a deal at that point. Louis's birth constituted a great relief for the Capetian dynasty. As you can imagine, at that point, Philip hadn't yet fathered a male heir, but in particular because Philip and Isabella's marriage was in tatters, the Capetians hadn't been the most successful in love. Louis was the first king of France to descend from both Hugh Capet through his father and through Hugh Capet's unsuccessful rival, Charles of Lower Lorraine, through his mother. We briefly discussed this. Hugh Capet is yet another leader I should make some video on, I would say. When Louis's mother died and his father departed on crusade in 1190, Louis was taken in and raised by his grandmother Adele of Champagne until Philip's return in December 1191. Right, we're talking about this just yesterday in the video about the Brabançons. Just imagine, by the way, you say you're a prince, you're going to be king, but what kind of a harsh life this really was. Between also the tensions between the Capetians, the Angevins, the threat of the entire monarchy to collapse to some degree. As prince heir to the crown, Philip II, estimating that the hereditary principle was definitively established, refused to associate his heir Louis to the throne and postponed even his knighting. Louis was made a knight in the castrum of Compiègne in Picardy, northeast of Paris, on May 17, 1209. But his father dedicated severe conditions, notably that he no longer jousted in tournaments, because it was a matter of sort of achieving manhood. As you know, this was both sort of political and military loaded as a concept. Tournaments were quite the thing in those years. All these young knights were incredibly eager to participate to that. But of course, you can perceive how already at this point the raison d'etat, to some degree, in this literal major state building in France, will basically pioneer throughout the Middle Ages compared to the rest of Europe, especially in its sort of gigantic size, would entail the necessity of some dynastic stability. And given the tournaments were incredibly dangerous, deadly, and still at this time mostly akin to actual battles in everything, of course, Philip made an understandably considerate, although traditionally unusual, decision. Right? The idea was also, let's make this children grow a backbone. If he dies, okay, well, the Holy Ghost did not smile upon us. In any case, things went well in summer 1195 to foster an alliance between Philip II and King Richard I of England. A marriage was suggested between the young Prince Louis and Eleanor of Brittany, Richard's niece. We've seen the parentage here. She was the daughter of Geoffroy the second of Brittany. That was, in fact, Richard's brother, and they had inherited Brittany from the previous heiress by marrying her. This, as you know, is interesting because in general, of course, here it wasn't a straightforward connection, but Brittany wouldn't be incorporated within France until the mid-16th century. In any case, this marital plan failed, reportedly due to the intervention of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI of Germany, who disapproved. This failure was also seen as a sign that Richard intended to pass the presumptive heir title to his brother John of England, rather than to Eleanor's brother, Arthur I of Brittany, as initially planned, leading to a rapid deterioration in relations between the two sovereigns. All right, Brittany was enshrined within the Angevin so-called empire. We explained what we defined by it. Was not really, say, a conventional empire, but still a formidable, massive, enormous sum of dynastically collected feudal domains, mostly in Atlantic France. On May the 23rd, 1200, after prolonged negotiations between Philip II and John's England, complicated by the interdict on the French kingdom imposed by the Council of Dijon on December 6, 1199, effective for 40 days following Christmas, which prohibited religious marriages or burials from January 1200, Louis married Blanche of Castile, who, as you know, will become the mom of Louis IX, Charles of Anjou, also especially being very present under her son's reign. Blanche was daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England, sister of John. Right, very interesting dynastic interconnection. If you're interested in Castilian history, you can go check the relative playlist out. We'll make something hopefully soon about that counter again. The marriage treaty was thus signed between Louis and Blanche on Monday, the 22nd of May, 1200. Following, by the way, regards dating from Ascension Thursday on May the 18th. Regard is, as we've seen also yesterday, the monk biographing Philip II's reign, at the place called Gueuleton, facing the current Île-aux-Bœufs on the Seine between Vernon and Les Andelys. The latter also a hotly contested castle at some point during the wars between the Angevins and Carpathians on the essentially Norman and what would be the Ile-de-France at large, or at least the Carpathian Crown lands territories. So it was a very symbolic attempt, at least at not necessarily reconciliation with the English that were, as we've seen, also married into the Castilian house, but a way to sort of show also that this international marriage had an important political weight. In fact, Blanche was to become the next Queen of France. And the wedding was celebrated the next day in the same location on lands of King John, where such ceremonies could proceed despite the interdict. Right, so this had been partially granted by the same King of England, given that Blanche was, as we explained, John's niece. So a gesture of goodwill between sort of enemies, friends, parents at the same time, as you understand, between all these intermarried dynasties. Now, belonging to the Carpathian dynasty, Louis' earlier years as a prince were far richer in events than his brief reign. And that's the point why he's also an interesting character, because very often, there are some great historical figures that are remembered, like think about Julian. He reigned too few as a whole, but he managed at least to remain sort of in the annals of history, not just because of the Christian, sort of the anti-Christian connection, but also because of his major exploit in Gaul, in Persia. Louis' reign was long enough to be quite dense, and yet fairly short, especially compared to the one of his father, his son. So he is, sort of partially put aside. And instead, he's a very important ruler. In 1213, Louis occupied the Flemish towns of Saint-Omer and Aire, along the coast, that were naturally quite strategic locations as far as especially the English interference in Flemish affairs that were notoriously troubled by sort of Carpathian attempts at expansion and, in fact, English sublimation against the French. And in fact, unsurprisingly, fostering animosity between Philip. Remember here, Louis was not king yet, and Count Renaud of Boulogne-sur-Mer. By 1214, Philip II faced, as you know, the greatest challenge of his life, a grand alliance of King John of England, Emperor Otto IV of Brunswick of the Holy Roman Empire, Count Renaud of Boulogne, and Count Ferdinand of Portugal as Count of Flanders at the time, together with William Longsword, the Earl of Salisbury, coming support. So this is the campaign of Bouvines. John had already attempted at sort of crushing Philip's power in 1204, but he had failed. This was the last final big and very threatening attempt as a pincer movement together with the Germans to basically break the back of the Capetian house. Right, and John almost succeeded. That's also why actually he has to be credited as a great ruler. And as you have understood, by this point I have some bias in favor of him because I think he's is a very underrated sovereign. And the plan, in fact, was to split Philip's forces. John would pressure from Poitou in a somewhat more conventional way, besieging some fortresses toward Paris in a northeastern direction, while Otto, the excommunicated emperor at that point, Renaud, Ferdinand, and Salisbury marched southwest towards Flanders, right, from the respective directions, naturally. The latter theater is where Bouvines was fought. Philip took command of northern forces against the emperor, leaving Louis to lead those confronting John in Poitou. And things did not even go too well, right? At least the campaign's first phase favored the English. John outmaneuvered Louis astutely, and by the end of June he had recovered Anjou and lost the city of Angers to Louis. So the quite sort of intense back and forth that also from the English side did not really achieve much. John then besieged the key stronghold of Rochemoine Castle. That's where things basically began to stall completely on that front, forcing the Battle of July the 2nd, 1214. Facing Louis' forces, local Poitevin nobles refused to advance with John because he was their king, and so regardless of the fact that up to that point, of course, they had sort of sneakily sort of exploited that, taken advantage of the situation to aggrandize their own power. They said, okay, well, but if we lose, even if we win at this point, like at some point the English will come back home, and or at least even if they succeed, not too much will happen to us. And it was such a fluid situation that it's also nonsensical to imagine what they were politically thinking, really, one by one. This, however, left John disadvantaged, so he retreated to La Rochelle on the Atlantic. Shortly afterward, in the north, Philip won the hard-fought Battle of Bouvines against Otto and John's other allies, ending John's hopes of retaking the Duchy of Normandy. That was also the ancestral house, at least of the Normans, that still the Angevins descended from, in part, and so a great symbol for also the English crown. I made 3 videos about the Battle of Bouvines. We'll make many others, because we made a video about the importance, the meaning of the battle, and we'll surely make more videos of the same kind, one about properly the tactical reconstruction of the battle, and another one just about the deployment of the armies at Bouvines. It's such a great battle, you can't spend this much time on it. We have just begun. In any case, the Battle of Bouvines is the big watershed, which also will benefit Louis VIII's reign. Nicknamed the Lion for his renown, Louis earned it during his father's reign by winning the aforementioned victory over John at La Roche-aux-Moines in 1214. In 1215, English barons rebelled against the unpopular King John in the First Barons' War, offering the throne to Louis, as we've seen, then princessing his wife Blanche, also as a descendant of Henry II of England, and thus niece to John, and so somehow sort of expandable for the political contingencies of the case. Louis prepared his army, and a new papal legate, as we've seen, Cardinal Gualabiceri, traveling from France to England, explicitly condemned this plan, because at the end of the day, well, there were many reasons why the papacy was doing so, but in general, right, there was a great architecture set, by Innocent III at the peak, properly, of papal power historically, it's been relative terms, and I partially made videos about Innocent's doings. That as fundamentally all popes was for a peaceful relation between all kingdoms of Christendom. I mean, if there was to exterminate heretics, that was a thing. It was to battle Muslims, another. And if you look at papal policy and international tendencies, like there wasn't something like, putting a Christian kingdom against another. Everything was about having peaceful relations, of course, greater papal control in these countries, but also compacting their action against especially the infidels for the crusade and so on. And all these kings here were historically just to normally contemplate the not just the duty but the opportunity of a crusading expedition, even beyond probably their spiritual benefit, and for how this traditional Catholic thinking was widespread, right, without exception, except for the rebels, but I mean not in power at this point in any country. Louis arrived, as we've seen, in London on June the 2nd, 1216, with 1,500 French soldiers, which is a pretty sizable army, considering that there are in fact, these other English forces, not just the barons, but probably English mercenaries as well. It's funny that just yesterday we were talking about exactly mercenaries during this phase of history. Also, the English at Bouvines were mostly mercenaries, right? Relatively far from home. There were actually a few Germans, and that England and France had been pioneering, at least as feudal monarchies, probably military service in terms of professional and monetized performance, expenditure, and so on. And needless to say, the French, after Bouvines and having taken over basically almost the entirety of France, aside from certain regions in the south, now were plenty of resources to rise vassals, but also mercenaries on their own, French or English alike, in the same Britain, by the way. So much so that Louis, in this occasion, took rapid control of the south of the country. That naturally was the most important, more developed, the more civilized, the one that had historically backed the monarchy against the Midlanders, say the Mercians, the Northerners, the Celtic French, and so on. As we've seen, though not formally crowned, many nobles rendered homage to Louis as King of England in London. The death of John in October 1216 paradoxically turned Louis's fortunes, because as we've seen, many noblemen at that point thought that tyrannical threat was no more and deserted Louis, that was sort of to be seen as the next tyrant, for young Henry III. It was complete sort of normal political swapping because of the rebalancing of the situation. In all of this, the epic figure of William Marshal, that, as we described also in the recent video, like literally was a de facto king of England. At least he also buried so many kings, and he always managed to win their trust, even in spite of former contrasts with them. So a clamorous figure. He was termed the best knight of the era by the same Philip II Augustus. So this titling entered the legend, really, right? Definitely an incarnation of chivalry, of knighthood himself. Well, William Marshal, on that occasion, inciting compatriots to fight for England's liberty. Very much in the spirit also, so you can't say the Magna Carta per se, because also at that point, William had sided with John, right? And so, but still realizing, of course, that there was something odd in this age of increasing sort of national stand in international scene of a French king being recognized as king of England. This had probably never happened. There had been, indeed, there still were French rulers of England in this sense, but not, say, in a linguistic, in ancestral term. But at this point, you literally had Louis becoming the next. At this point, was the prince, the would-be king, but still like an incredibly prestigious position. In 1217, taking advantage of the war in England, Louis also initiated the conquest of Guyenne, telling again how powerful at this point France is, leaving Henry III, in fact, only a small region around Bordeaux, which is basically what the English had left on the continent by that point. Louis's forces clashed with the English at the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, where he was defeated, followed by the subsequent naval defeat, we said it, at the Battle of the Five Islands, also known as Sandwich, in August, leading to the treaty. The treaty's main content was the amnesty for rebel barons. Louis promised, because of course England was also exhausted after the defeat on the continent, civil war, and so on. So there was a great deal of horrifying things that had happened, including so many English barons signing with Louis. So there was some also good word put by the Saint Louis in the treaty for what that was worth. Louis promised not to attack England again, and the 10,000 marks paid in exchange for his pledge never to consent to becoming King of England. All right, so not just not to invade again, but not to essentially accept any other baronial invitation to Britain, so to say. After the treaty, Louis quit the kingdom. As prince and fulfilling his father Philip II's crusading vow, from 1293 to 1223, Louis led forces during the Albigensian crusade, raging in Occitania, in support of Simon de Montfort the Elder. In April 1215, a papal legate cautioned him not to impede the crusade. Right at Narbonne, he ordered the destruction of the town's fortifications amid disagreements between Simon de Montfort and Arnaud Amalric. These were the main leaders, respectively the lay and the ecclesiastical leader of the campaign, forcing the Viscount of Narbonne and other authorities to swear loyalty to Simon. By the way, I don't think we have to introduce the Albigensian crusade. If anything, I'm going to make probably a military history of the same that we've never done on Schwerpunkt, and at some point we will make more of a political history of all the minutes in many other videos. But as you know, I made lots of videos about the Cathars, made a video about the County of Toulouse, there is a playlist about medieval Occitania, so we'll gradually sort of build that further up. While at Toulouse, most important city in the south, Louis ordered city officials to tear down walls, fill in the moat, and accept Simon as head of government. This was a brutal measure of the militarization of what had been the most powerful Occitanian polity out there. The County of Toulouse had suffered basically the indecision of this sort of half feudal and half communal system. And, the cities of southern France were more similar to the central, the northern Italian ones. But still, there was a heavier feudal dimension. So while, France was incredibly successful because it went on all feudal, while still having, of course, communes framed, enshrined by the hierarchical order of the crown. And the Catholic kingdom had gone full sort of communal and city-state. Occitania had historically remained more fragmented. It's also what allowed the Angevin Empire to sort of collect all these various polities at some point. Not much Toulouse that was sort of more independent-minded towards anyone, right? They were more connected with, say, Aragon than these other powers. But because, in fact, that was a bit the frailty of the Angevin so-called empires, that this was just a collection of relatively loose states, right? Even when we say Aquitaine, technically, that was the local lordship that had acquired control of this wider area that today we also call kind of Aquitaine. The Duchy of Aquitaine was smaller. Nothing to do with the Capetian principality that held, of course, the crown of France. It was much more sort of imperially compact, and as we have seen here, managed to win this brutal struggle. Also in the south, was heavily punished also for being the receptacle of so many heretical, anti-property establishment, anti-Catholic, anti-papal, anti-French, anti-monarchic ideologies. The Albigensian crusade began in 1209 as a clash with Cathar exponents, mostly Languedoc, evolved into a clash, in fact, between northern and Occitan and southern noblemen. Northern lords had moderate success until 1215, but rebellions eroded gains through 1225, culminating in the siege of Avignon, in Venaissin. In 1219, Louis captured Marmande, during the crusade as well. As you know, the crusade was a massacre. Also, like the crusaders had sort of this was mostly northern noblemen that Philip II had sent away, relying against the Angevins mostly with mercenaries, as we were also, this is notorious, we were talking about yesterday as well. Mercenaries served also in this theater for the Capetians. Simon de Montfort died with his head smashed by a mangonel shot, apparently not manned, but literally women, in fact, by women from the city, the siege of Toulouse. And at that point, in fact, most of the Crusader control collapsed, except Occitania was exhausted, and later it would be Louis' son that, as you know, took over everything in a seigneurial, monarchic fashion. Also, in fact, securing France finally a Mediterranean port. All right. All this was historically Western Frankish kingdom, but up to this point, the Capetians had not managed to reach, especially the south. Philip II died on July the 14th, 1223. And so, since la bannière ne meurt jamais, once the king is dead, long live the new king, Louis succeeded his father as the new king of France without contest. Pretty solid political situation, as his father, by the way, had designated him successor, taken all measures. This had been done, as we've seen, in the 1190 will that went unchallenged, rendering the ritual dubbing of barons, Capetian heritage, unnecessary. In fact, by now, not just the Capetian house would just secure the control of France, but there was enough to involve the same Capetian, family members, entire principalities, such as, for example, Louis will do with Anjou, with his last son, that was destined to become yet another king in Sicily. Louis was the first Capetian king, not saker, that is anointed according to the ritual in Rome. I have a video about medieval Rome as coming up soon, as king during his father's lifetime. Right. Archbishop William of Joinville of Rheims anointed and crowned him, however, on August 6, 1223, in Rheims Cathedral alongside Queen Blanche of Castile. Because the traditional Catholic vision of this is that, of course, the woman at that point in the sacred marriage that they had already consumed was essentially just a continuation of her husband. And so she participated sacredness, aside from being daughter of kings, and kings' ancestors were hers, with Bishop Milo de Nanteuil of Beauvais holding the king's mantle to symbolize their union in the process. So literally as if they were the same person, because that's the actual point of marriage, led by the husband. Louis' brief reign was marked by two brilliant campaigns, one against the English in Guyenne, and the other against Raymond VII of Toulouse. He narrated a relatively favorable political situation, but two pending problems resolved through military action, combating English reconquest attempts, because it's not like the English had simply given up, or the Capetians from Paris could simply literally control the entirety of France, especially places like Bordeaux that could be easily accessed by an enemy fleet. They were far away. France is really huge, geographically speaking. And to imagine we're in the 13th century, in terms of communications, power control, etc. At this point, actually, the Capetians are making a gigantic effort to develop, in fact, an administration, a bureaucracy to control this unprecedentedly large amount of territory. In fact, the English were asserting firmer control over former Plantagenet domains south of the Loire. The other challenge was settling the Albigensian crusade account once and for all, initiated independently in 1209, also by the French lords, with some sort of blessing from the side of Philip II, and devolved into permanent war between the new papal-backed conquest power and the traditional counts of Toulouse. that still didn't want to give up, and in this moment represented by young Raymond VII with local support of the Occitanian barons. Simon de Montfort, crusade leader, died in 1218. The papacy had assigned him Toulouse's lands west of the Rhone as an actual fief in practice, but on St. Peter's behalf. His son Amaury VI de Montfort inherited this land in 1218 amid full revolt, by the way, of the local barons and lacking his father's talent. Simon de Montfort was one of the greatest commanders of his era, pioneered flank attacks at an unprecedented scale. He crushed and killed the King of Aragon at the Battle of Bouvines. Again, he had basically taken over almost the entirety of Occitania all by himself before his death. But rarely, like such great fathers, have such great children. And so Amaury proved unable to hold the constantly rebellious territories while facing, at this point, Raymond VII's resurgence campaign. So he ceded his rights on Languedoc to the King of France instead, in exchange for the dignity of constable, the kingdom's highest office, which was not a bad move. Under pretext that the English court had not fully executed the 1217 treaty conditions and profiting from Henry III's minority, Louis decided to seize remaining English possessions in France, refusing to renew the truce on May the 5th, 1224. In a rapid campaign in the same year against the Angevin Empire, he invaded Gascony, seized Poitou, La Rochelle, in August 1224, Saintonge, Angoumois, Limousin, Périgord, Quercy, and parts of Bordelais. So as we've seen before, that campaign that culminated with the remainder of only Bordeaux in the hands of Henry III. Also, Gascony was untouched because that's also further south. And it is also bordering Spain. I mean, there are issues there, but in general, that's how Louis seized basically almost the entirety of the Angevin possessions left in France, right? Essentially just the Anglo-Norman islands remaining under English sovereignty. To accomplish this, Louis allied with Hugues X of Lusignan, promising him Bordeaux if Gascony were conquered. Lusignan was, again, closer to those regions, so he had some sway over them, but things would not quite succeed. By some summer's end of the same year, same campaign, Louis had pacified Poitou and adjacent regions, Ony and Saintonge, and taken La Rochelle. After all, these had historically been French vassals. Also, the Angevins held these territories, recognizing the French king's authority. However, there were still partisans of, say, favoring a possible English coming back to preserve their own autonomy against the rising Capetian star, and they were brutally suppressed. In 1226, further campaigns captured numerous Languedoc cities, including Nîmes, Castres, Carcassonne, Albi, Béziers, Beaucaire, and Marseille. So we're looking at the entire Occitanian arc, right, from Languedoc to Provence, which is fascinating, by the way, because some of these territories laid essentially in a frontier area with the Holy Roman Empire as well, all right? If you look at Provence itself, this was not part of the Kingdom of France. Charles of Anjou, Louis' son, will, through marriage policy, become the Count of Provence. And in this quality, he would eventually invade Sicily, defeat Manfred, later Conrad. But there is this incredible expansion of Capetian power where, communities fell under their control. They just secured the same on them. By 1226, Louis' lack of military support in Gascony embittered Hugues X of Lusignan. Because it's not like resources were infinite. Also, probably the Capetians didn't want to render Saint Hugues too powerful, which was always an issue because, again, would does side with him. Like, if you want to control this southern territories, you must receive like the support of the local establishment, and that, as we've seen, was not really very much in favor of the Capetians. So there was a more attritional policy at the end of the day, and a smoother one that would basically play on probably the augmentation of the Capetian power to basically just show the Occitanians it was completely useless in the later generations to oppose themselves to the crown. In any case, as we've seen, they didn't have really a political, military, critical mass compared to the Northerners. Part of Raymond VII's lands in the Kingdom of France, plus other holdings, formed the nucleus of a new royal Mediterranean domain. Right? Louis accomplished probably the takeover, as we've seen, of the County of Toulouse, the same capital, that was disarmed, essentially. The rest of the country would revert to the crown soon via forced marital alliance. Lands east of the Rhone were soon claimed by the papacy, also because at least there was some concern for the Holy Roman Empire, etc. You know that Avignon later on was, for example, on the Rhone River itself, where the papal curia at some point will move from Rome, staying there up to the. Most of this happened during most of the 14th century. Louis' 1226 expedition through the Rhone Valley began in imperial territory, with Avignon's capture, and proceeded to Languedoc's submission. So this was also an affront to the Holy Roman Emperor, that, as we've seen, had tendentially not been very happy with Capetian overexpansion, considered at this point, especially these are the years of Frederick II, there is some sort of enmity already sort of materializing beforehand between the Capetians, France, and probably in the Holy Roman Empire, as basically the former was rising and the latter was about to shrink, especially after the death of Frederick II. And while there wasn't quite a direct clash between the two yet, and also by the time of Charles of Anjou and his campaigns in Sicily that were at least belonging namely to the ruling house of the Holy Roman Empire as kings of Sicily, Louis IX, for example, did not intervene and actually discouraged, or at least did not formally back his brother nor intervene in the clash. He had actually a negative idea. Incredibly different brothers, by the way. On November 1st, 1223, Louis issued an ordinance prohibiting his officials from recording or collecting debts owed to Jews, reversing his father Philip's policies and annulling such claims, which was a way to actually damage the Jews in that process of gradual expulsion from France. We've seen it also under Edward I of England's reign, etc., to also largely allow, in fact, the same Capetian officials here to benefit from the voiding of such debts they had contracted. Usury was condemned by the Catholic Church, with practitioners liable for excommunication. So it was generally practiced through Jewish intermediaries, especially when look at these high sort of subtle positions. The point was that the Jews could not be excommunicated, and in any case, they were still considered responsible for their actions, since in the Christian vision they had to go to hell anyway. This was fundamentally a way to circumvent the also relative bans on. Usually, there were some measures of money lending that were fundamentally tolerated, with some ways of considering basically this interest just as the pay for maintaining that money. It's also obvious, as banking is going to quickly rise at some point, and so it was obvious that, say, whether you want to consider it usury or not, was still practiced. Naturally, Jews had some safe havens also in other countries, but in these ones they would be expelled, also quite brutally, and this in fact, was essentially a legal gray area where even leylanders could demand or permit it, often causing state-church frictions as well. So what Louis had done was not fully in line with even the Catholic issues. This aimed to address the same. 26 barons accepted, but powerful Theobald I of Navarre, Count of Champagne, if you're interested, I also made a video about the County of Champagne, refused obedience, as he profited from taxing usury via agreements with the Jews. And so it was convenient for him, the Jews, to be still there in the system. So he became the leader of the anti-Capetian faction. His hostility evident, for instance, during Avignon's siege, where he provided minimal service of 40 days before returning home amid treason accusations. This is an old story. The 40 days were basically the bare minimum that was imposed on vassals when the king called. I made an entire video explaining how, French recruitment switched from this ideal vassalic beneficiary mechanism to more fully monetarized fashion, like across all the kingdom. Again, multiple videos. For France in particular, they had the greatest issues. Normally, these guys were paid still, but at least it was believed that for the first 40 days they had just to serve simply with their means, with their prepaid means that the fief, the beneficium, entailed. In 1225, the financial impact on Jewish moneylenders led Louis to invite Lombard moneylenders to Paris. These were also, again, quite successful, and there hadn't been much of an issue with sort of their Catholicism. Christians were required to repay only the principal of loans to Jews paid to the king or lords with direct authority over them, removing royal or baronial assistance for Jews. Financial means were needed anyway. This was also a way to simply cash in short-term Jewish money, but not really, in fact, structurally providing with the installation of other moneylenders, hence why the Italians were called in. In 1223, Pope Honorius III sent a letter entreating Louis to act against the Albigensians. The south of France was, as we've seen, the theater of this pretty brutal combat still, and Raymond VII, Count of Toulouse, had remained suspected by the Church of harboring Cathars. So just to see more in depth how Louis addressed the whole issue. Like in 1225, the Council of Bourges excommunicated him, declaring heresy, destruction, a necessity, and a new crusade against Cathars indispensable. Louis was chosen to lead, taking the cross and promising a tenth of clerical incomes for it, participating to consolidate his power. At Easter 1226 festivities in Bourges, thousands of knights gathered with the king. The army moved to the Rhone Valley, where the lords and cities hastened to submit. Avignon, belonging to Raymond VII, and at least having donated itself to the Count of Toulouse, considered Languedoc's key, because from there it could literally cross the Rhone into the broader Occitanian west, refused to open gates. And that's when Louis besieged it, avoiding storming. A frontal assault in August was fiercely repelled, however. And after 3 months, on September the 9th, 1226, Avignon finally surrendered, agreeing to pay 6,000 marks, hand over hostages, and destroy walls, though his army suffered heavy losses. This is also the measure, of course, part of the political fragmentation of the south, but also its important encapsulation, fortification. Avignon, if you've ever visited, it's beautiful. It has, even just immediately, visibly, a pretty hell of a strategic position. Raymond VII had barricaded in Toulouse, meanwhile, and crusaders struck by winter diseases and defections adjourned the siege. In October 1226, arriving at Toulouse, the royal army was too tired and weak to attack. So Louis planned to return to Paris and assault Raymond VII the next season. He rejected peace overtures from Roger Bernard II of Foix, with another Occitanian prince, pressing on to retake Avignon and proceed. Another interesting aspect were Louis VIII's relations with Frederick II, characterized by mutual concern, as we highlighted, to prolong their pre-existing alliance, but marked by, in fact, initial difficulties from French southern offensives and the general magnitudinal increase in French international stature that was essentially, especially compared with probably with Germany, the style and institutional advance of Germany, like dwarfing the latter. If anything, Frederick II, as you know, widely preferred southern Italy. But he was also a proud German ruler, and he cared very much about at least attempting at power concentrating in Germany. Eventually, he would have to abandon that hope, especially after the rebellion of his son Conrad, where many German princes started confiscating public property, and Frederick at that point decided that he had enough problems of his own in Mediterranean to just start selling them, and to create in Swabia and along the Alpine arc some sort of state that could secure at least the passes to Italy from Germany. So as a private prince in Germany as well. Frederick valued maintaining good ties with the main Western power. So at the same time, nobody had at this point any specific political reason. If you look at the two land masses to attack one another, there had been issues in the past between the French and the Germans. But in the moment, the French were busy consolidating internally after all, because that would become not much of the greatest challenge, but what would naturally absorb most resources. And Frederick had a much more sort of Mediterranean policy and beyond. Louis equally sought benevolent neutrality against English threats, by the way, and non-intervention favoring Toulouse counts. The 12 treaties were renewed at Catania in Sicily in 1223, stipulating Frederick would not negotiate with England's king without French agreement. Talks extended to a November 1224 meeting between French diplomats and young king of the Romans, Henry, that would be the Henry VII, in fact, the rebel eventual king of Germany, rebel to his father, at traditional Vaucouleurs, where Louis had met Frederick 12 years earlier already, aiming for a fuller alliance treaty between France and the Holy Roman Empire. This revealed tensions cracking Capetian Hohenstaufen enmity. Archbishop Engelbert of Cologne, a chief advisor to the young Henry, tried sabotaging it to support England, because the Archbishop of Cologne had historically very strong ties with England because of the Rhine traffics in the North Sea and the Channel. So this was also one of the main concerns. And as we've seen, Henry would become a pawn of rebellious kings. But the bishops of Cologne hadn't been too loyal, starting from Adolf of Altena at the time. I made a video about this quite early on, quite recently, during the rise of Philip of Swabia. Eventually was assassinated, and Otto of Brunswick had risen again. So that's the extent by which the Saint German princes were sabotaging the Holy Roman Imperial endeavor there, and proposing, by the way, marriage between Henry and the English king's sister, so to actually tighten the relations between at least this part of Germany and England, which, as you know, had already been a thing during Angevin times. Think a bit about Matilda, Henry V, like that scenario. 1 century before, but still. This diplomatic uncertainty exemplified tensions from Henry's drift from his father's positions. That's when he rebelled, and French messengers informed Frederick of the unsatisfactory talks, and he pressured his son to conclude properly with Louis. In 1225, per prior clauses, Frederick asked Louis not to support Cambrésis inhabitants rebelling against their archbishop, who might seek aid near the French realm, because that was part of the Holy Roman Empire. But Louis' 1226 Provençal and Languedoc expedition caused the gravest frictions, especially as we've seen Avignon's capture that had happened in imperial territory east of the Rhone. Again, huge deal, because there will always be this kind of embarrassment between the two areas. Actually, the French will not occupy what was the kingdom of Burgundy-Arles. As we've seen, there were also Capetians ruling from there, but at that point as lawful imperial subjects. I made a video about the Dauphiné, a couple of them, explaining a bit what was the situation there, how fundamentally the French still, say, legally embarrassed in the 15th century took over places like Lyon, because that simply gave themselves to it. Naturally, we're far away from this time, but already in this moment, the sense was that the French were sort of a bit also testing the ground, aside from the strategic contingencies of necessity of taking over Avignon, a frontier, a border city, you can argue, with the empire. Remember that Otto of Brunswick had literally invaded, had fought with the French quite recently. So even though the Hohenstaufen were of another mold, well, at the end of the day, it was still this Germanic empire that the French were rightfully wary of. French barons preempted rupture risks with a justificatory letter insisting no imperial rights violation and highlighting papal legate action as well in the area, because they were, after all, part of the broader crusade. All right. Nonetheless, this east of the Rhone intervention set a significant precedent indifferent to Frederick amid his fluctuating papal ties, by the way. He was being excommunicated, so he didn't really care. It seemed more like an affront to the whole Roman Empire. A year after Louis's death, Frederick would also renew the alliance on same terms with young Louis IX to ensure stability. That's also quite interesting. At some point, these meetings between, Holy Roman emperors and French kings, like the one, for example, Philip IV with Rudolf of Habsburg, that's quite interesting. Now, during Louis' brief reign, emerging tensions, English agreement leanings, provincial intervention fears cooled Capetian-Hohenstaufen alliance without breaking it. So that's the general picture. They managed to keep things relatively in order. While returning from the crusade to Paris, after the first invasion, Louis fell ill with dysentery and died on November the 8th, 1226, at Château de Montpensier in Auvergne. So he didn't make it even halfway through. 10 years before the same John had died. The same way, these were incredibly common illnesses, considering hygiene at the time, and the strains also. That was mostly the exhaustion of these individuals. We've seen it also with Henry V. It's incredibly common for men literally spending their entire life on horseback, or almost. Some rumors even accused Theobald IV of Champagne of having poisoned the king. Right? Louis had reigned only 3 years. Contrasting his father Philip Augustus and grandfather Louis VII's combined 86 years of reign, from 1137 to 1223. Enormous reigns. Also characterized, Philip Augustus's one definitely by great triumph, but also setbacks at the beginning. Same was for Louis VII. Think about the Second Crusade, the failure with Eleanor. Lots of issues. So what I was saying at the beginning, comparatively to his father, grandfather, but also his son, Louis IX, who would reign 43 years and 9 months, 1226, 1270, would apparently dwarf Louis VIII's significance as a ruler. Louis, June 2025 disposition, instructed son Louis to succeed as king, with younger sons receiving appanages. Robert got Artois. John Tristan acquired Maine and Anjou. Alphonse gained Poitou and Auvergne. Louis' heart and entrails were deposited in the Premonastrensian Abbey at Saint-André-le-Clermont, between Chamalières and Clermont-Ferrand. On November 15, 1226, magnificent funeral rites preceded his inhumation in the royal necropolis of the Saint-Denis Basilica, north of Paris. Again, the symbol of France par excellence. There is no France outside of Saint-Denis. All right. And so, of course, the the burial place of the kings of France. I shall make a video about Saint-Denis because it's too mystical and too universal and too imperial and too Catholic, too French, too traditional, not to stress. In fact, this immense Carpathian, and not only, of course, I was talking Clovis, right, as you know, in origin, and housing, in fact, in this case, Louis VIII's tomb until at least the 100 Years' War, when, in fact, a magnificent gold and silver ciseled tomb was replaced by a simple slab. On October the 19th, 1793, horrifyingly enough, revolutionaries profaned Louis' tomb, discovering a stone-covered coffin with a half-relief carved cross. Overturning the lid revealed the king's body wrapped in a gold woven shroud, the only sovereign found buried thus, by the way. Like other royal remains, it was criminally thrown into a lime-filled pit at the Valois Rotunda site in the Basilica's northeast garden. Let's skip these horrendous details. The French Revolution, as I described in many videos, it wasn't only this, fortunately, but it was, for the fact of being this alone, was one of the most traumatically disgusting and terrifying things in the history of mankind. It can be understood, say, only when contextualized, but not justified at all, nor especially in terms of how a sovereign like Louis VIII would have, of course, thought. Blanche of Castile bore, we don't fully know, because there were lots of abortions that failed, like also simple children born, this was the most typical thing, born and dead after a very short while. And so we don't fully know through the historical documentation of the time if they even existed at some point. According to Jacques Le Goff, Blanche would have born 2 or 3 early children who died young. This was terribly normal at the time, especially the earliest time. They were incredibly vulnerable. And we don't know how many they were, nor whether they were male, female, when they had been born, when they had died to begin with. And so we will never know. But Louis and Blanche's children were, for sure, a daughter, possibly named Blanche herself, who died basically an infant, 1 year old or something. Agnes, who died also within the same year. She was born 1207. Then you have Philippe, who died at 9, not even at 8, September the 9th, 1209, June the 30th, 1218. To imagine even to be born and raised, by the way, in which, in a way, this was normality, in which you had seen 1/3 of your siblings on their deathbed, and you had also 1/3 of your own children. You would see 1/3 of your children on your deathbed. This is completely different world in relation with existence, with mortality, with the fact there you've seen that Louis was shrouded in a golden cloth in his tomb is also quite meaningful, right? Remember the sacrality of the kings. Remember what his father did on the battlefield of Bouvines. These guys were not just anointed, and so holy sovereigns, but in this sense, they truly thought to achieve a level of immortality. We don't stress this enough. The young Philip, the kid Philip, was betrothed in July 12, 15 or 17 to Agnes of Donzy, who lived in the early 12th century. She also died at 23, 22, like, again. She was the Countess of Nevers, Auxerre and Tonnerre. Then you have Alphonse, born on January 26, 1213, died shortly after birth, who was twin of John, who also died shortly after birth. Then Louis, born in Poissy on April 25th, 1214, and died on August the 25th, 1270, in Tunis, famously enough. We'll look at that expedition, even though it didn't go too far. As you know, exactly because of Louis' passing, he is the later King Louis IX, Saint Louis of France, successor, with living descendants to the present, by the way. Robert I, other son, born on September the 25th or 28th, 1216, and died on February the 9th or 8th, 1250. Killed at Mansoura in Egypt during the earlier expedition in Egypt, where also his brother Louis was captured. In really very interesting crusading campaign. He received an appanage, as we said before, the Count of Artois. He married Mao of Brabant with posterity. I made a video about the Duchy of Brabant. You can look at the story of that. Then you have another Philip that, however, died an infant, a couple of years old, born in 1218. Then Jean or John Tristan, born on July the 21st, 1219, and died in 1232. He was pretty young as well. He received the appanage, the Count of Anjou and Maine, dying, as we've seen, young, but he was betrothed in March 1227 to Yolande of Brittany. Then Alphonse or Alphonse, Poissy, November the 11th, 1220, August the 21st, 1271, Corneto, receiving the appanage as Count of Poitiers, Auvergne, and by marriage, by the way, marrying Jean, Count of Toulouse, the same Toulouse. Jean lived between 1220 and 1271. They didn't have children, though. Then you have Philip Dagobert, hell of a name, because, as you know, Dagobert was one of the most successful Merovingian rulers, at least one of those lucky Frankish rulers that witnessed the death of all their siblings competing for power, vying for power, and sort of having the sense of unity. Remember here all the names, aside from the children who had already died with that name, so he wanted the name Philip to live on. Dagobert was an auspicious name. Unfortunately, however, he also died young. He was born in February 1222 or 1223 and died in 1232. And this is terrible if you think about it. Then you have Isabella or Isabel, March the 16th, 1225, February the 23rd, 1269, 1270, betrothed to Hugh de la Marche. Then in 1252, foundress and abbess of the Longchamp Clarisses. She was beatified. And for this also, she wasn't, she didn't really go on with motherhood. Etienne, so Stephen, born in Paris on December the 27th to the 31st, 1225, and died, sadly enough, either the following spring or following autumn. Charles, he was born after Louis VIII's death, right? Interestingly enough. In fact, he was born in Vendôme in March, March the 21st, 1227. He died on January the 7th, 1285, all right, at 58. This Charles was, in fact, the youngest of his children, and he would become, in fact, Charles of Anjou, right? He was bestowed this appanage by his brother Louis from the brother John that had died, as we've seen, in 1232. And so Charles of Anjou, in his grace, but I made a video about him entirely, and as you know, he had this escalation, Count of Anjou, and men from his, dead brothers. Then by marriage, Count of Provence and Forcalquier, which provided him with a launching pad for the conquest of the King of Sicily as a crusade from 1266, acquiring the crown. Then he lost Sicily proper with the Vespers, so he basically was king of Naples, even though the title was always king of Sicily. He was also king of Jerusalem. And in 1246, not reigning there, of course, 1246, he married Beatrice of Provence. That was the one who gave him the southern part of the king of Arles, Toulouse, Arles, Burgundy. 1234, 1267, as she was concerned. And Charles would also remarry in 1268, in fact, after her wife's passing, to Margaret of Burgundy. 1248, 1308. Notoriously, this is the house of Anjou that reigned over southern Italy and these other possessions, also overseas in Greece and etc. And they were among the most, actually the richest under Charles, the richest kingdom in Europe, even more than Louis IX's France, at least until Sicily was lost to the Aragonese. And so yeah, this is basically the relatively concise history, of course, of Louis VIII's reign and a bit of sort of his genealogical context, right? You understand how dense history is and how, evidential history is necessary. Biographies, proper, reflection and sort of chronological superimpositions, contemporaries, because if you study, there are so many perspectives, right? You must study, as we've seen in the original series, what happened to this or that country. You must study what happened in this or that battle. You also have to study the entire history of these people, because without that you can't fully appreciate how relevant their doings really was and how sort of advanced, let's say, how important evidential history is, how much political history defines really something can go in a direction or another. And so there is nothing sort of deterministic, but something that is vehiculated, that is part of a broader mechanism that sort of gets mutually involved in this making, but that in fact requires a great attention to action, to the individual, to really the actions of single that really do change because they're more important than the others, what the others in fact also do, right? And this can't be denied. We will keep talking about this. By the way, now my medieval French playlist really needed this, like all sort of thematic topics almost, but now we pass to the big guns of actual kings, and we have, interestingly enough, a pretty hefty medieval France playlist. This is the 113th video about French history, and again, this is, I think, quite important now to add finally as a form of content. After all, the history of France, at least in a more sort of unitary sense, is the history of kings. Right, so if you don't study those, you can't fully appreciate medieval France, right, at so many levels. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.